I couldn't believe it, but I stayed there. The group was large, so I didn't know who was capable of doing anything like that. Like, I know I didn't have nothing to do with it, but I was getting blamed for it. When I was in the room, I didn't know what was going on. I didn't even go by the name of Antron. That's why I know they didn't know me. Anybody who knew me as Strong. That's why I know when it's like, well, Kevin said Antron did it. I'm like, who's Kevin? I don't even know Kevin. Kevin don't know me. I didn't know who did it. I just know I didn't do it. So I was just trying to get everybody back. I was just blaming whoever.
My name is Elizabeth Lederer. I'm an assistant district attorney in New York County. We'd like to talk to you tonight about what happened in Central Park last night on the night of April 19th of 1989.
Central Park, April 19th, 1989. A jogger, Trisha Maley, running through the park late at night, was raped and then put into a deathly state. This crime, no doubt, was committed by a man with no moral character. But ladies and gentlemen, I must establish first and foremost the fact that despite the world putting the weight of this crime on my client, 15-year-old Antron McCray's shoulders, this instead was a severe mistake. Before putting forth indisputable evidence of this fact, I need to set the scene of how such a terrible accident could have occurred. Crack epidemic surging through the city, putting the streets under pressure, as well as leaving behind a lingering sense of fear. Under the weight of what a chronic drug outbreak means for the people living in areas of extreme poverty, a chronic disease of child neglection, the amount of newborns testing positive for drugs quadrupling, the decimation of the nuclear family, where 90% of children living in low socioeconomic centers in the city were raised by non-immediate family, as well as doubling of homicide rates in young black males as young as 14. Ladies and gentlemen, when I reflect on my childhood, I think about how lucky I was to have both of my parents, a brother, and a very enthusiastic dog. I remember being very reluctant to do the simple things like laundry. My biggest worry was juggling my passions in school. I didn't want to do my homework on a random Thursday, or I didn't want to go to practice on a Wednesday. These were privileged worries. I need to emphasize more than ever that the problems that you and I have most likely endured, as adults no less, do not remotely compare to what these children have to deal with on a daily basis. So when the police were alerted to what had happened to Trisha at 1:30 a.m., and 30 boys of African-American descent were seen to be congregating in Central Park that night to hang out, there was no question of what the police were thinking. The police drew attention to Antron's group because they were at the park at the same time that the crime had occurred. This was merely circumstantial, and yet it was treated like a crime on its own. Antron is a teenager. Of course he's going to make mistakes. Reports of harassment and theft steered the police's attention to them. The kids had violated the trust of the police, but that shouldn't be enough to warrant what they had to go through. Assuming that these small acts of misconduct were enough to assume suspicion of guilt for the horrific crime committed on Miss Maley, police went to putting the children of McCray's group into custody, and they were interrogated for the crime. 7 hours of interrogation, I'd like to point out. My client, along with 4 others, were put through 7 hours of brutal interrogation, aimed so that they would get a confession of guilt, not the truth. Without the ability to contact their families and a lack of food and water, they were terrified for their lives and for their futures. I mean, how are you supposed to react to being accused of the rape of a woman you had never seen, let alone heard of? They were promised everything would be all right as long as they said they did it. So that day, on the basis of the testimonies by other youths confirming his involvement, along with a statement of guilt from Antron himself, has led to the predicament we find ourselves in now. But I reiterate that my client did not do this. This case instead illustrates a classic example of systematic racism and injustice present throughout our court system towards marginalized groups, and the consequences of what an abundance of crime in cities means for the increasing amount of false incarcerations. The truth is, this case is a violation of trust between our Justice Department and my client. The first thing we need to look at is the DNA sample evidence gathered at the site by forensic analysts. At Maley's body, they encountered a DNA sperm sample of the assaulter, where after tests were conducted, it was concluded that the sample didn't match Antron's, nor any of the convicted boys. I have to ask the jury genuinely how it would be possible that my client would have raped this woman if it wasn't even his DNA found at the scene. To further disprove this, I need to point out that if you look at the testimonies which each boy made pleading guilty for the crime, you'll notice that none of them make any sense. They all have discrepancies in location, time of when the crime was committed, information as to who was there and who was involved. With a lack of evidence and merely circumstantial existence in the park, it is unreasonable that my client committed this crime. While my client did initially plead guilty for the crime on May, he did so because he was being exploited by law enforcement. With all the conditions I've mentioned, from misconduct in the interrogation room to the atmosphere of the city with the crack epidemic, there is undeniably victims of false conviction. Might I just remind the jury that this criminal we are speaking of is 15 years old. 15. This child cannot possibly be the mastermind behind such a heinous crime. It is not fair that we live in this system. It's not fair that this boy was born into a world where he can't trust the city he lives in. But please, I ask you, do what's right. Say that Antron McCray didn't do this. I ask the jury that for the false conviction of Antron McCray, for the crime committed on Tricia Maley, that he should be awarded $5 million from the city of New York with release without parole and a public declaration of his innocence with an apology from the NYPD reps. I'd like to corroborate that while the crime that was committed is a terrible one, the killer will be found. Please make the right choice and vote not guilty. It's the least you can do for the truth.